We're running about 6 minutes behind, which isn't too bad as these things go. And we've benefited from Jeff's very, very effective introduction this morning, and also two luminous papers. My introduction will be somewhat brief for now, in part because, in consideration of the time, but also because Professor Bodell, who is our next speaker, is well known to all of you. I've known John for about 11 to 12 years, and for the last 6 or 7 years, probably going on 7 to 8, he and I, as you know, have been co-directing the program in early cultures here at Brown, along with Sue Alcock, who has left in the past 2 years for the University of Michigan. John did his undergraduate degree at Princeton, and then he went on to do his degree at the University of Michigan, eventually taking an assistant professorship at Harvard, leaving then for Rutgers, where he spent a number of years before coming to Brown, again in about 2003 or so. John is known around the world, particularly in the Latinist community, for his close, meticulous, and often and always, I should say, perceptive and insightful study of Latin inscriptions. He also has two other interests, one of which would be that of Roman slavery, and slavery in a comparative vantage point, something of broad concern here at Brown. For compelling historical reasons. And he's also been much interested over the last years, and is soon preparing a magnum opus on the matter of Roman death and death ways and death concepts. John will be presenting this morning on the semiotics of signa, or the significance of symbols in Roman stamps. Please join me in welcoming John, please. If you want.
Might be good. Thanks very much, Steve. I'll dive right in. Let us begin in the foothills of the Apennines, at the sanctuary to an unknown Oscan deity, or deities, in the Samnite town of Pietrabondante, a regional center of the Pentri people since the 6th century BCE, and the site since the 3rd century of a large octa-style Ionic temple that by the end of the following century had fallen into disrepair. It was around that time, about 100 BCE, that 2 slave women were making roof tiles to repair the roof of the temple. We know this from one of the tiles, which was found in 1975, stacked with others in a portico adjoining the temple complex, where it had been temporarily removed before reinstallation. The tile was marked on the back before firing with 2 graffiti inscriptions scratched with a sharp tool into the wet clay from opposite sides of the clay. One, the one on the top in the image here, in Oscan, and therefore running right to left. The other below, in Latin, read left to right according to our conventions, disposed on either side of 2 pairs of identical or nearly identical footprints. The text of the 2 graffiti records slightly different messages. There's the Oscan text running left to right with its translation, and from the bottom of the 2 lines shown above the footprints up, and there is the Latin text running left to right as expected and read down. The Oscan text indicates that debt-free, or the debt-free, it is unclear whether the word is a proper name or an indicator of occupation or status. So debt-free, the slave of Herennius Satius, signed with a footprint. In the Latin text, Amica, the slave of Herennius, probably the same Herennius, says that she signed when they, that is we, were setting the tile to dry. The 2 pairs of footprints represent visually what the Latin text implies. Verbally, in the first person plural ending of the verb pono, we placed it, that the 2 women collaborated in making and setting the tile. The orientation of the 2 texts shows that they worked on opposite sides, and the variation in language and content suggests the sort of playful exchange which turns on difference. You say potato, I say potato. But the positioning of the 2 pairs of footprints, evenly spaced and fully aligned, convey equality and unison, as does the uniform orientation and vector of all 3 elements of the document, both texts and both pairs of footprints, all running left to right in the same direction. The 2 texts together provide context in the slave workers by name, which makes all the more noteworthy the formulation of debt-free, for whom it is not the verbiage in either language that authenticates her work, but the footprint with which she signed, literally stamped it. This mode of signing one's work must have occurred very early on to brickmakers across the Mediterranean world, since the widespread practice of laying mold-formed clay tiles flat to dry in the sun before firing inevitably exposed them to casual marking by birds and other wildlife, as here in this broken 2-foot Roman brick, a bipedalus, I'll say more about brick sizes in a few moments, which shows animal tracks as well as a stamp of the late 3rd century CE. This image and several of those to follow are from a wonderful exhibition called Made in Roma, which is on display now at the Markets of Trajan in Rome, which brings together makers' marks and craftsmen's signatures on objects of everyday life from across the Roman Empire. If any of you will be in Rome in the next 2 weeks, I recommend you stop by and see it. It's only on for that much longer. The footprints themselves are worth remarking. They were made with a type of shoe common in Samnium, and according to one editor, the same shoe was used to make all 4 footprints. However that may be, the shoe prints are of the same size and exhibit the same characteristic triangular pattern of dot-like impressions made by the nail heads used to affix the soles to the upper part of the shoe. 5 at the toe, 3 at the heel. I'll return to this distinctive form of patterning later. The shape of the footprint, in any case, caught on as a symbol of authorship among the manufacturers of ceramic products, particularly fine tableware, where it passed from the underside to the face of the object and served an ornamental as well as a practical function. As, for example, here, in this Aretine bowl, where a stylized footprint is stamped within an incised ring at the center of the bowl. Or here, in this fragment, where an irregularly inscribed surrounding ring intersects the heel of the footprint, which itself encloses a brief text identifying the maker as a slave, Hermas. This latter form, a fusion of the textual and the semiological signature, became standard in fine tableware, where the fiction of the footprint was frequently maintained through the representation of the toes of a foot as seen from the top, as here in the upper left and the lower right. A note in the lower left, the footprint is in relief and the letters are in incuse. There's this sort of variation as well in the stamps. Of course, a footprint in relief is a fiction, nothing like the original. It's a symbol. With this incongruous overpacking of information, the significance conveyed by the distinctive shape of the footprint, a visual reminder in miniature of a natural form of signing, the most basic type of kiln-fired molded clay product, a brick, is compounded by the addition of textual information identifying the manufacturer, so that the footprint shape no longer stands as a purely iconic replica of its original, but becomes an amalgamated symbol, a sema or sign with a distinctive semantic value. At the same time, whether in consequence of the new fusion or as a motivation of it, when the sign is transposed from the hidden underside to the visible surface of the object, the perspective of the viewer is imagined to have moved with it, so that the foot is now seen from above rather than below. Sometimes, however, the original distinctive pattern made by a shoe-clad footprint in wet clay, which preserves the characteristic features of its source, including tack heads where the soles are attached, is conveyed obliquely by a representation of patterned decorative ornamentation in place of the text. As here, where a pair of stylized rosettes is arranged symmetrically within the shape of a realistically rendered foot. The image of geometric symmetry and regularity within a curvilinear shape, originally created accidentally, or rather we might say incidentally, through a process of signing with a shoe sole that created a distinctive impression in wet clay, is transferred and transformed into an iconic symbol now 2 steps removed from its original functional purpose and context. But this metamorphosis of a mark of authorship into an ornamental device, which we find almost exclusively in fine tableware, is virtually unique in the history of the clay products on which the Romans employed stamps. In practically all other cases, stamps were functional rather than decorative, and textual rather than figural. They served variously to identify the product, mainly, it seems, for internal production or transport purposes, rather than, say, for the benefit of retail consumers as brand marks. In the most complex cases, the stamps were accompanied by graphic marks, some but not all textual, made with other media, paint, dipinti, or a sharp tool, graffiti, or even the human body, finger swipes or handprints are common. Some evidently related to the manufacture of the clay object, others of these related to different aspects of the production or transport process. The jars used to transport perishable commodities such as wine and oil, at times across long distance overseas, provide a case in point. And I will now summarize some of the evidence I have. Here you see a slide showing the basic centers of production in Baetica in southern Spain and their port of destination at Rome, a place called Monte Testaccio. And there's a map of the region of Monte Testaccio in southern Rome. It's the farthest point up at which ocean-going vessels can ford the Tiber. It's at the lower part of Rome, and this was the major commercial warehouse district. You can see the outline of Monte Testaccio and the map on the right in relief, and you get a sense of where it is on the plan on the left. Now, the Monte Testaccio, the pile of terracotta, is not a casual slag heap, as some thought, a rubbish heap. It's actually carefully constructed. You can get some sense of the chaos that it looks like today from the three images on the top and the right. But on the left-hand side, taken on the far side of the hill, you can see, in fact, how carefully it's been terraced up, so that, in fact, it's a constructed hill. What seems to have been the case, it had paths leading up to the top of it. It ultimately reached some 30 meters in height. Workmen had to climb up the pile, and paths were constructed for them to do it, paths of broken terracotta. Then they would apparently break their amphorae on the top of it, and then spread them evenly to create a firm layer for further terracing beyond. It's curious that Monte Testaccio is constructed almost entirely of amphorae of this type, so-called Dressel 20 amphorae, which were made for carrying oil, and that's the main product from Baetica. Evidently, they understood that mixing oil amphorae with, say, wine amphorae or those that carried grains could cause problems with corruption of the clay, and actually putrid, rancid smells would emanate from the site. They figured by putting a little lime down on the oil, which they did regularly, Monte Testaccio still exists today as a pristine pile of terracotta in the southern part of a very hip district of Rome. It's estimated that there's some 53 million of those pots in all. But the point I want to draw your attention to here, showing you on the left an example of a Dressel 20 amphorae with some amphora handle stamps, and on the right-hand side, a very complicated diagram illustrating the production process and the different marks that would be placed onto an amphora at different stages. I'll go through that very quickly. Initially, the potter would inscribe his name on the very bottom, the little nipple of the amphora, which would never be seen after the pot was fired. They would stand upright on these. So we have potter's signatures written in the wet clay and graffiti. Before firing, we also have impressed stamps on the body and on the handle. And I give you a couple of examples there. And then following firing, during the transport and storage process, there were painted texts added on to the top of the amphorae. And I show you some examples there on the right. So each one of these Dressel 20 amphorae normally bore three different types of inscriptions: a graffito text made on the bottom, one or more stamps impressed in the wet clay before firing, and then various painted texts added after firing. The series and the sequencing of the text is quite complicated. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but you can see how many texts ultimately accumulated on the necks of these. This is a Dressel 1 amphora, a slightly different size. And there are different interpretations of how they were meant to be read, up and down, left and right, and so on. But in addition to all these fairly well understood texts, their purpose and their function, I won't take you through, there are a number of unidentified marks, as they're so-called, marks of unknown significance on the amphorae of Monte Testaccio. Now, the excavators from Seville started excavating in the 1970s and found that the top of the pile was pottery datable to about 250 CE. They're slowly working their way down the stratigraphy. Nobody knows, in fact, how old Monte Testaccio is. We won't know until they reach the bottom, when we'll reach ground level, and suspected that might be in the 1st century CE. But right now we have dating stratigraphy from 250 to about 140, maybe a little further now. They keep working, about 135 perhaps. But gradually we're acquiring a much more refined chronology of how these potters' signatures stack up with the handle stamps and so on, and eventually we'll have a quite refined chronology. So that part of the process of understanding these containers is fairly well advanced. But this sort of thing is entirely mysterious, and it's only in the last 15 years that they've even begun to be collected, and they've not even been categorized. Here's another illustration, and I've highlighted one such mark so you can see what they actually look like. They appear in different positions on the amphorae. This one's just under the handle, and it's not clear at all what these indicate. To sum up this part, if the overall structure and system of the variously deployed stamps, graffiti and dipinti on oil amphorae from Monte Testaccio, is fairly well understood, the precise function of many of the painted text remains obscure, and work has scarcely begun on the marks of unknown significance, which have only recently begun to be noticed and recorded, and have not yet been cataloged or even arranged into broad categories. Very different is the situation within the Roman brick industry and the more streamlined, if no less complex system of stamping that marked its products. Roman bricks came in 4 standard sizes. A bipedalis, a 2-foot brick, square, which I show you some examples in situ here from Hadrian's Villa. Sesquipedales, a 1.5-foot square bricks. Basales, 8 inches on a side. You can get the sense of the drawings of all of them. And then a half a basalis called a semilateris or semilateres, triangular bricks. And you can see from the drawings to the right how the different shapes and sizes were multiples of themselves. So the basales, you could fit 9 basales within a bipedalis, and so on, 18 semilateres, and so on. But these are the basic tools through which Rome is built. And I mean Rome of the first 3 centuries CE. Just incidentally, notice the bipedales in situ with stamps and the paw print next to one of that stamps in the lower right. So this happens all the time. In addition to roof tiles and large bricks, the same manufactories, in addition to the large bricks, they also manufactured roof tiles, which so-called tegulae, which I show you here, and also some large clay storage products, dolia, big storage jars in the upper right, mortaria, or basins and bowls. You can see one in the foreground there from, from Wessex Archaeology Service, where the nicely preserved stamp on the lip of the mortarium. And then finally, also fired in these same kilns were the so-called campana reliefs, named after the man Giuseppe Campana, who first published them in 1840. They have nothing to do with the Italian sense of campana, except in his name. But these, as you can see, are molded terracotta reliefs and sometimes quite elaborate. It might be debated whether there were more amphorae piled up in Terracotta Hill, Monte Testaccio, which I say are estimated at 53 million, or bricks in Imperial Rome. But it is clear that the Roman brick industry of the early empire, that's the first 3 centuries, was a thriving machine, producing hundreds of thousands of bricks per year for over 200 years, and that a majority of those bricks went into public and private buildings in the metropolis of nearly 1 million residents that Rome was to become by the start of the period. For despite the claim of the first emperor Augustus to have found Rome a city of brick and to have left it a city of marble, the Roman brick industry only first began to take off toward the end of his reign, in the early years of the 1st century. And now I'm afraid I'm going to have to take about 10 minutes and explain a little of the background to the brick industry itself, which will all provide general context for my returning to atextual stamps and trying to set them into context. There were active clay installations, so-called figlini, in Rome on the Vatican Hill and in the region of Trastevere. But the brickyards that supplied the capital extended throughout the Tiber Valley, and the territories they comprised included much of central Umbria and Etruria. Whereas amphorae came up the Tiber from Ostia to Rome, as I've shown you, as containers and were discarded there at Monte Testaccio, bricks were floated down the Tiber as the primary cargo, with Rome as their purposed destination. The value of these brickyards throughout the Tiber Valley as economic enterprises may be judged by the early investment in them by senatorial families and other Romans significant enough to have entered the historical record, and by the history of their consolidation over the course of the 2nd century into the hands of the imperial family, so that by the end of the century, the emperor owned all the brickyards and enjoyed an exclusive monopoly on brick production for the capital. During the first half of the century, bricks were normally stamped with a single name, which is normally taken to be that of the owner or manager of the brickyards rather than of an actual workman, in part because of the form of the name, which usually indicates a Roman citizen, but also because, unlike the case with amphorae, not every brick was stamped. At first, the names were disposed within rectangular frames, or in the case of impressed letters, unframed, but around the middle of the 1st century, a new form of circular stamp begins to appear, with the text now disposed in a crescent within the lower part of the circle, and the upper area occupied at times by a figured image known as a signum, plural signa. And here you see on the left an eagle looking left with wings spread, and the upper right a full figure of victory with arm extending, holding up a crown and scepter. And let's see, below, between the two lines of text, you find a sistrum, that distinctively shaped rattle used in the cult of Isis, with decorative palm fronds at the end of the lines. And incidentally, I mentioned these are normally one-line stamps. The second line, the lower line of that crescent-shaped stamp with the sistrum in the middle of it, simply says, Valeat qui fecit. It's a benediction. May he who made this brick fare well. So it's not an identifier, it's just a benediction. Over the succeeding decades, the textual information was expanded to include a second name, as well as the name of the estate or clay fields where the brick originated, necessitating the addition of concentric crescents of text and shrinking the size of the circular field in which the signum had appeared, known as the orbiculus, and making it possible now to distinguish two roles, those of landowner and business operator, so-called officinator, whether an independent or a dependent contractor, and pushing the signum into the center of the stamp. The original purpose of the figured emblems is unclear, but by the end of the 2nd century, signa had become distinctive emblems of individual units of production, officinae, within the brickyards, and were used by their managers, officinatores, to identify their work. And the signum itself becomes often enclosed entirely within a ring of text at the center of the stamp. And here on the left, I show you 3 examples taken from this period, the reign of Septimius Severus, about 190 to 210, just the time at which all the brickyards had become consolidated in the hands of the emperor. And by this time, the orbiculus, the little circle, has been reduced by the expansion of text to the height of only a single line. In the upper left, you see a full figure image of Hercules with club and lion skin facing left. Below, a bust of Apollo with radiate crown looking right. And to the right, a crab representing the zodiacal symbol of Cancer. And zodiac signs were quite common. We'll come back to astral visions perhaps later. By this period, end of the 2nd century, the function of the signum in identifying a unit of production, rather than the producer per se within a brickyards, is clear. Earlier, with the lunate stamps and their successors, the use of figured images seems more fluid and variable, and no consistent patterns of usage emerge. Amidst the tide of uncertainty about the meaning of signa that washes between the open improvisation of the early years of the 1st century and the fixed moorings laid down in the Severan period at the end of the 2nd, a stable beacon stands out in the figure of Marcus Rutilius Lupus, prefect of Egypt during the years 114 to 116, and one of the main builders of warehouses and apartment blocks in the city of Ostia during the early years of the Emperor Hadrian, who became emperor in 117, until Lupus seems to have died in or around 123. I promise we won't have a chronology quiz at the end. Lupus, though, introduced a number of innovations in practice and perhaps in the internal organization into the Roman brick industry, of which 2 in particular deserve our attention here. First, in the year 110 CE, Lupus introduced at his brickyards, the Figlini Bruttiani, the practice of marking bricks with the names of the consuls in office when the brick was manufactured, thus indicating the date of the brick within a year or often part of a year. He repeated this experiment in a few of the following years, 114, 117, 121, and then in the year 123 CE, for reasons that remain entirely obscure, all brick manufactories stamped their bricks with the consular year, evidently because of a new requirement to do so. They weren't doing this voluntarily, and that source of which can only have been the emperor itself. There would be no one else who had the authority to institute wholesale in 1 year a radical change in practice. In that 1 year, 123, many brickyards that had previously been unknown to us first appear. Others are mentioned only then and not before or after. And in the years following 123, the practice of marking bricks with consular dates continued sporadically at a few brickyards before petering it out altogether to the end of Hadrian's reign around the year 140. So it didn't stick. We have this 1 year, 123, when we get a snapshot of all the brick industry in one particular year, and then it goes away. And some we can see through the consular dating of stamps in following years a little more clearly, but by and large not. Second, the second innovation. In the year 114, so in the same period of innovation, Lupus, whose name means wolf, began using a wolf emblem on the bricks he produced at his Figlini Bruttiani. Here I show you an example from the year 115, exhibiting both the new consular dating and the wolf signum as an emblem for Lupus. Here, all the basic elements of Lupus's stamps of this period at the Bruttiani, an indication of the consular date, the speaking signum, and Lupus's initials, MRL, at the beginning of the line. All three elements are set here in the formulaic fashion that Lupus would employ variously over the next 8 years in the more than 30 different stamps with essentially this formula that he issued during that period. One significant variation seems systematic. Stamps of Lupus with the speaking signum and stamps of Lupus with named officinatores are mutually exclusive. Those that show one do not show the other. From this, we conclude that the speaking signum serves the same grammatical function within the formula as the abbreviated names of officinatores, in indicating the person rather than the place responsible for the manufacture of the brick. In subsequent years, speaking signa, those that addressed the name, were deployed variously and indiscriminately by brickyard owners to mark their ownership of the property, by officinatores to indicate their responsibility for the products they produced, and by one or the other to evoke the name of the clay fields from which the brick derived. Our earliest known use of a speaking signum belongs to this last category and shows that already, at the start of the 1st century, 100 years before Lupus and 200 years before Septimius Severus, Romans were prepared to read symbolic images synthetically together with text in a sophisticated fashion that calls for both verbal and iconographic dexterity. Here is a stamp of Lucius Atinius from a brickyards we know from 3 other texts to have been called the Figlini ad Mercurium Felicem, that is, the Figlini near the temple of Mercury the Fortunate. Here the name of Atinius appears with the AT in ligature beneath a large palm frond that arcs from a bust of Mercury at the left to the epithet Felicem, supply the M, at the right, bridging, as it were, the separate modalities of signum and text to comprise a synthetic message in which the image is to be read in rebus, with the name of the deity pronounced, and the positioning of the name Atinius, the manufacturer, near, in fact, sheltered within the name of the temple, replicates the locational force of the preposition ad. Lupus's innovation was to assign to the speaking signum of the wolf a particular semantic value beyond its simple purpose of identifying him, specifically that of marking his place within the production process of that of manufacturer. He was also the landowner, as it happens. His initials indicate that, but the signum marks his role rather than his identity, although it also happens to indicate the latter. It's this aspect of Lupus's practice at the Bruttiani in the teens and early 20s of the 2nd century that eventually crystallized at the end of the century into a fully systematic use of signa, now fully detached from any personal significance to an individual, to mark production units, officinae, within a brickyards. And it is this one of Lupus's innovations that brings us at last back to the use of atextual stamps in the Roman brick industry. For it's in precisely the two periods in which we find the major innovations in the use of signa most clearly expressed, that is, the eras of Hadrian, about 115 to 140, let's say, and Septimius Severus, about 190 to 210. It's in these periods that we find the most revealing evidence also of how atextual stamps were used. In the time remaining, I propose to review briefly what we've learned recently within the last couple of decades about the use of atextual stamps, mainly from the investigations of two archaeologists working in Rome, Henri Boise of the École Française de Rome, and Pekka Tuomisto at the Institutum Romanum Finlandiae. I'll do that. I will glance briefly at a recently discovered case of a rather different use of atextual stamps outside of Rome, in Sicily. And if time permits, I'll hazard a few preliminary observations about what the imperfectly preserved, recorded, and understood evidence suggests about general principles of this particular semasiographic practice. First, unlike orbicular stamps with signa, which are found exclusively on the larger bricks, the bipedales, tegulae, and sesquipedales, atextual stamps are found only on the smaller bricks, the basales and semilateres. Second, as I mentioned, whereas only a minority of the larger bricks were stamped, Bloch estimated that the percentages ranged from between 5% and 20% at different periods of the bipedales and tegulae. During the periods when stamping was practiced, it seems that every basalis bore a stamp. So there's a fundamental functional difference between how the large bricks were marked and the smaller bricks were marked, not only in the type of marks, but in the systematic application of the marks or lack thereof. The earliest datable atextual stamps we know are found precisely in the same year that mandatory consular dating was introduced into all Roman brickyards in 123. That's probably not a coincidence. That is, if the systematic dating of bricks at all brickyards points to a measure of fiscal control exercised at the global, i.e. the imperial level, the introduction of atextual stamps suggests a form of internal control exercised within the production unit. Two distinctive series of stamps presenting two different types of independent marks point to a similar system of internal organization. One of the major producers of the Hadrianic era, Marcus Annius Verus, in 123 issued a series of stamps with identical characteristics, consular dating in the first line, and in the second line, the name of a slave. Some 40 slaves of Annius Verus are thus known to have been working at his brickyards in the year 123, each evidently in charge of his own production unit. Boise has now discovered that paired with the stamps of certain slaves are atextual stamps of different varieties that seem to point to a further subdivision of control within the units of each slave officinator. So here on the left, you see the end of a two-line rectangular stamp with the consular date of 123 in the first line, and the end of the slave name Primigenius in the second line. Above it, a few centimeters away, is an impressed ring. On the right top is a drawing of the stamp, and below, another stamp of this same series, this one of the slave Mercurius, with two different circular markings above and below the stamp. What is most striking about these stamps is that both have been found in more than one copy, and in all the copies of the same stamp, the disposition of the inscribed text with respect to the atextual stamp is identical. From this it follows that the two stamps were impressed at the same time in the same way. Furthermore, it seems that all of the stamps of the same matrix also appear in the same positions on the individual basales, on the individual bricks. The most plausible explanation is that a square of wood was cut to the same dimensions as a basalis brick, that is 8 Roman inches square, then had affixed to it two or more elements, a metallic stamp indicating the consular date and the name of the slave of Verus in whose unit the brick was produced, and a second, atextual stamp or set of stamps that marked some further internal unit of administration. The wooden plaque would then have been squared on the brick and impressed, leaving identically spaced markings on all the basales so marked. The second series of the officinator Marcus Vinicius Pantagatus achieves the same goal in the same year with a different technique. Beneath an incuse 2-line stamp with consular dating in the first line and the name of Vinicius Pantagatus in the second, a series of a dozen or more different sets of initials, all written retrograde, is outlined by a row of conical impressions made by nail heads hammered into the wooden support that held the consular dating. So here, for example, you see the end of the 3-letter abbreviation EUS for a slave named Eustathius or Eustachus or the like. If we leap forward to the end of the century and the early years of the third, we find again a major change in the practice of stamping the larger bricks, associated or at least coincident with the institution of a new practice of marking basales with atextual stamps. After the reign of Septimius's son and successor Caracalla, textual stamps disappear from larger bricks altogether and are not found again in any form until the end of the century, when they reflect a wholesale reorganization and apparently a reinvigorating of the Roman brick industry, in exhibiting new forms of stamp, circular with incuse letters, new textual terminology, and evidently a new syntax. All of these change. At the same time, during the reign of Septimius, a revised system of atextual markings reappears on basales. No longer do textual stamps bearing a date accompany the atextual stamps, which continue to be created by circular discs and patterns of nail heads in various combinations, but now are supplemented by a third type of device added to the repertoire of elements from which distinctive textual markings could be fabricated, small metallic pieces of what seem to be primarily military hardware. Here, for example, are 2 examples from the Baths of Caracalla showing the same stamp, a complex discoid combination of 2 interlocking crescents, which, when linked, take the form of a shield. Apparently, to judge from Roman military equipment published elsewhere, this is a fastening of a buckle for a shoulder strap. And here is a diagram illustrating several of the types of shapes that are found, which seem to represent various pieces of military hardware. Beginning at the left side, the top 3 patterns, 3, 4, and 5, were probably all made by metal appliques attached to belts or shoulder straps. The design on the bottom left, number 9, seems to have come from the decorative metal strip at the end of a thong. The figure in the upper right has the support for a lateral plume of a helmet, but is too large to have served exactly that purpose. And finally, the designs in the lower right, 8 and 11, correspond to the shape of the fastenings found on military scabbards. These elements were used in ever more complicated combinations to create a virtually infinite and open system of individual distinctive markings, which were impressed at the time when the molded clay bricks were nearly sun-dried but not yet fired. One can tell this because one finds still preserved in the base of many of the stamps the striations made by the comb used to smooth the clay into the brick mold. Here I show you several combinations found by Boise in buildings of the Severan age. Boise concluded from the prominence in these hybrid stamps of military hardware that it was only the army making bricks at this period, which may be true for the smaller bricks, but seems not to be so for the larger ones. These atextual stamps were still in use at the time the Aurelian Wall was built around the perimeter of the city at the end of the 3rd quarter of the 3rd century. But with the reforms of Diocletian beginning a decade later, they seem to disappear also. When atextual stamps resurface in the Roman brick industry in the 4th and 5th centuries, they assume very different forms and seem to fill rather different purposes, like this little emoji I used in my title slide. That's a 5th century form. You could see very different. The atextual stamp is now in relief. It's formed by a molding itself. It's a very different kind of stamp. I leave these aside further. We'll hear more from Ildar this afternoon about this period, though not, I think, about brick stamps per se. Finally, before we leave the brick stamps of Rome, I must mention one final type of atextual stamp that was used to mark at least some basales during the Hadrianic period. Only recently did Henri Boise discover, through painstaking examination of the surfaces of a number of basales in raking light, that some were further marked very close to the time of complete air drying, with small rosettes impressed or possibly actually cut into the nearly hardened clay surface. Here are 2, very faintly visible. The purpose of these markings, which seem to have been added separately, independently, at close to the stage of full drying, is entirely unclear. Let us leave Rome now to glance very briefly at an interesting, recently discovered instance of atextual stamping in a provincial context. At a rural site known as Gerace in the center of Sicily, some 10 kilometers south of Enna, ongoing excavation of a late Roman villa site, first exposed in 1994, and in the summer of 2013, recorded and uncovered 99 different tile stamps on 75 fragments of roof tiles. That is, several of the fragments bore more than one stamp. All of the stamps were created by 10 different matrices, each represented by a single die. 2 are rectangular in shape, 5 are circular, 1 is oval, and 2 present text within the outline of a dolphin. Here I show you the 10 different dies, many of which allude in text or images or both to the name of the proprietor, Philippianus, presumably the villa owner. The stamps haven't been found elsewhere, whose name means literally horse lover. I draw your attention to die number 3, the left one in the middle, a circular ring with the single name Philippiane written counterclockwise around the perimeter, which in the example illustrated here exhibits at the center of the stamp an inner partial ring of stab marks made separately with a sharp tool impressed repeatedly into the clay. In fact, the center of stamp number 3 is found with several different combinations of elements, which were added independently after the outer ring was impressed. Usually, the added element is one of the smaller stamps figuring a horse, numbers 5 to 7. But these were at times replaced or supplemented by a series of stab marks, such as the ones drawn in example 3. I show you here some photos of actual specimens. Numbers 10 to 12 at the top and lower left are employing that same outer ring of type 3. Within the outer ring, number 10 in the top left shows at the center of the ring a stamp of die number 5, off-center but clearly visible above a crescent of stab marks. Below, at number 12, the center of the stamp shows an impression of die number 7, with a horse facing right. And in the upper right, an example with stab marks alone. Finally, in the lower right, an example of one of the dolphin stamps, which, unlike the others, bear one of 2 anodyne texts, salus, safety, or tutela, protection, as in the other examples. These dolphin stamps appear almost exclusively on the rim or flange of the tiles, often in conjunction with other textual stamps employed perpendicularly on the side of the body. In this still imperfectly understood and evidently localized system of marking, each of 3 or 4 separate elements is deployed independently in various combinations to mark perhaps different stages of the production process, with each contributing workman or station represented by an individual stamp that could be combined variously with others to mark a particular sign of responsibility for any individual product. With virtually every tile marked in some fashion, such a system would enable a comprehensive record of the fabrication sequence or combination of each tile. Yeah, to sum up, good, thanks, these are my last slides. Individual systems of atextual marking of clay products seem to have been short-lived, except at Rome, where they were also highly localized. The original impetus for atextual stamps probably came from natural phenomena, animal tracks, footprints, casual marks. The methods of marking were simple: discs, nail heads, objects of daily use. The systems themselves were also simple, aimed mainly at establishing distinctive identity, no indication of accounting or tallying or any kind of numerical process going on with the atextual stamps. However, although the systems were simple, with multiple elements, internal system of distinctive marking could nonetheless be highly complex. Finally, with few exceptions, even when the system is recognized, the purpose of most of the markings is obscure. And I'll leave you with this one last enigmatic image, which brings together the beginning and the end of my story for today. And thank you for your patience.
We're about 5 minutes behind, but that's okay. But perhaps we should do, can you entertain one?
I could.
Question?
I'm sorry it took so long.
No, that's.
If there is one.
Jeff, I think.
That's right. I work with him, so it's let someone who's not old.
John, you pick whoever you.
Matthew, did you have something?
No, I just had a question about whether there are any examples of the physical stamps themselves, or are we dealing mostly with just impressions, and how many stamps do we actually have? And the kind of related question of, you showed some variation of similar objects that were used in a contemporary setting where you have slight variations. Are there other indices of mass production of stamps, or are they more often unique things, or unique things in combination, as you showed at the end?
They're more often unique things in combination. Like coins, you can have dies recarved, and so you might have the same text and image, but slightly graphically different, which lets you see a new die is being used. But that's rather rare. And in fact, what we find more often, because the dies for the textual stamps tend to be made of wood, we often find a die cracking, and you can relatively date different brick stamped with it by how bad the crack has become. I mean, they never get better, they only get worse. So as it widens, you can have some internal chronologies. But to answer your first question, do we have any examples? Of the textual stamps, yes. Of the atextual stamps, no, other than we have military equipment that has those shapes. And it's thought that many of those concentric shapes and discs are formed simply by what's at hand. Maybe the end of a whip would give you those internal concentric controls, or the end of a stick. So just something at hand. It doesn't have to be very meaningful, it's just distinguishing.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
And for our final presentation this morning, we have Howard Tsai, who's come to us from the University of Michigan, where he has been lecturing in the Center for Latin American Studies. Howard took his BA at UCLA and then his master's and his PhD at the University of Michigan. His dissertation, which will soon be out as a book from the University of Alabama, dealt with his excavations in an 11th century community in the Jequetepeque Valley of the north coast of Peru. It's an area that is also well known for having hosted the Moche civilization, which is going through permutations at this time as well. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Howard to come up and offer his presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Professor John Bodell and Professor Stephen Houston for inviting me to this very innovative and much needed conference on Maker's Marks. So when I got the email from them inviting me to present this conference, I thought, wow, there's actually people who are interested in marks. That's kind of surprising. But marks are actually very common and very ubiquitous among ancient states and civilizations around the world. For example, a recent article I read on the Journal for Anthropological Archaeology talks about maker's marks on Qing terracotta soldiers. And it was really interesting that the soldier will have a different mark from the weapon is carrying. So meaning there are two different workshops producing the soldier and the weapon. And if we go back to early excavations by Sir Arthur Evans, and he also noted mason's marks on the palaces of Knossos on Crete. Today's talk, I'm going to divide into 4 parts. And first, I'm going to talk about this, what we call the classic labor tax model developed by Michael Mosley for the Huacas of Moche, this monumental site on the north coast of Peru. And then I'm going to talk about a ethnographic case collected by Professor Gary Urton at the town of Pacarictambo in southern Peru near Cusco. Then I want to complicate the scenario a little bit. Mosley's model is sort of supposes this sort of one segment with a single maker's mark and single brick size. And what I'm going to show is that the sites of later periods and that pattern breaks apart and no longer holds for later sites. And finally, to conclude, I must confess was a little bit too theoretically over ambitious in my abstract. It's almost kind of like a movie trailer that tells you the bad ending of a movie. But I do want to conclude by just briefly suggesting this co-evolution between state compliance and invasion, and how a state try to capture labor from communities and leading to this feedback process of escaping from that. So this is the series of publications by Michael Mosley and Chuck Hastings about the Huacas of Moche. first published in 1975 in American Antiquity. This is the area where, of North Coast Peru, which has a series of these river valleys, and the site of the Huacas of Moche is located in the lower Moche Valley, and it dates to AD 100. We really don't know the early chronology of the site, but around 100, 200, and by AD 800, the site was probably abandoned. And here is a Google Earth view of the Huacas of Moche. The term Huaca in Quechua right now means some place of power, sacred power, and the receives offering. But in modern usage on the north coast of Peru, the Huaca is usually an archaeological site or ruin where the looters, the huaqueros, have a great time finding fabulous gold and riches. So those are the double meaning of the Huaca. And at the site, you have this massive Huaca del Sol and Huaca de la Luna. In terms of looting, well, the Spanish got there first. If you look at Huaca del Sol, that's only actually a remnant of the original size. Somehow the Spanish, as a part of a colonial mining operation, diverted the canal of the Moche River and then somehow washed out over half the Huaca del Sol. And then there was a colonial document listing all the riches and gold they found from this looting operation. Really fascinating. And between Huaca del Sol and Huaca de Luna, recent excavations by Dr. Santiago Uceda have actually uncovered residences, workshops, and perhaps workers' quarters in an area right in between the two Huacas. So it seems to be like an urban center over here. And this is Huaca del Sol as it stands today. There's that little black dot is a guy on a horse for scale. It's massive. It measures 300 by 150 meters as dimension and over 40 meters tall. And it contains an astounding more than 140 million bricks. And this is probably the largest solid mud brick building in the New World. So I don't know of any other candidate for that. And across the urban zone, it's a smaller counterpart, the Huaca de la Luna, which contains just 15 million bricks. And the work by Dr. Santiago Uceda at National University Trujillo, it's still ongoing. And then when you go visit Trujillo in Peru, go take a look at Huaca de la Luna. They're finding really cool stuff with freezers and corridors. So stuff is still coming out of Huaca de la Luna. What Moseley found was that these two Huacas were built in segments, as you can see here on top. They're basically these segments or blocks of adobes that are used to build the Huacas of Moche, and they kept them separate so that the segments were not bounded. They just left it there. And besides that, he also found various maker's marks on the mud bricks of Moche, and he documented something like more than 100 of these marks. Now, 6 marks different kinds of marks were very common, and then 63 are very rare. So he kind of thought there was maybe there's 100 communities. I have my own theory on that. I could talk about it later, but here are the variety of maker's marks at Moche. So this is what he found. And within each segment of that construction, they tend to have the same kind of maker's mark. Besides that, they also tend to have the same brick size. So here you see one of the common maker's marks is the X. Okay, so you see how all the bricks are the same size and they're clustered together. And I'll show you another one. This is another very common mark, is the diagonal. And it's also showing up together on bricks at the same size and also the same kind of soil type, soil composition. And this leads him to infer that each segment was actually built by a community of workers from Moche society. So these workers, it's a straightforward link of production. The workers would build the adobe, mark them, and then contribute the labor in putting up the Huaca. He mentioned some kind of ethnographic analogy. He used the historical case from Trujillo about workers building the defensive walls around Trujillo. I'm going to use this term IU, which is the modern Andean counterpart of this patrilineal land-holding corporate group. Perhaps it's these kind of groups that I use, each making a segment of the monument. So can we see this in the ethnographic record? And I want to now cite the work of Professor Gary Urton and his work at the town of Pacarictambo, where he collected a series of photographs. Actually, he took the photographs in the 1980s, documenting the church walls of Pacarictambo. So what happens here, you see the Google Earth view of Pacarictambo with its church. And what happens is that these different IUs within, there are some 10 IUs at the town of Pacarictambo, and they're really complex. They're divided into these upper and lower moieties, the Hanan and the Huring. But essentially, these IUs were responsible, each IU was responsible for a segment of the church wall in terms of maintaining and upkeeping the church wall. And he was able to document by a photograph the kind of life history of each of the segment and provided a history of actually the communities and the IUs. So this is what happens. For example, if you see this wall over here that's deteriorating, falling apart, that was the responsibility of this IU called Waichu. Now, Waichu was sort of infamously known for being sort of disorganized and poor, and really couldn't keep up with the wall, so that wall fell apart. What's really interesting is that there are these other walls. For example, this one was the responsibility of San Miguel. And San Miguel, one year, I guess it was in 1980 or 81, they decided to make it really nice and paint and plaster the wall and also put a fired tile roof over it. And now the community next year, the community next to it, Naiwa, realized, oh, geez, those guys are making their walls really nice. We better do something about ours as well. So they decided to also paint and roof their wall. And then that was also then followed by Pierca over to the left of San Miguel. So what happens is this. You have a external authority, in this case the church, demanding the construction of this wall, but that's it. Whatever later the structure of those walls depended on the community structure and the inter-community interaction that occurred. So I think as archaeologists, we often think of monuments as these sort of top-down or bottom-up interactions, very monolithic, but we kind of have to take the monument apart and think about it in terms of the local interaction between and within communities. Another thing I want to talk about right now, about halfway through the presentation, is this symbolic meaning of making adobes. And I wanted to talk about the concept of Aini and Minca in terms of reciprocal and non-reciprocal labor. Modern Andean communities are really sensitive to the difference between these two kind of labors. Aini's reciprocal labor, where if I help you build a house, you help me, a month down the line or in a week, building my house. Whereas Minca's non-reciprocal labor, which and nowadays it refers to paid or wage labor. So if I pay you to build my house, I have no obligation to help you build your house later because I paid you. And Andean communities now really recognize the inherent, unequal, and hierarchical relationship between the two. So in terms of adobe structures, I believe that it basically symbolizes that it is an unequal direction in terms of labor. So if the communities build the pyramids for the Moche elite is not going to build adobe structures back. So I'm going to take, on Andean studies, I will take the heterodox view that the Andean state does not reciprocate. And now we move on to the work of Izumi Shimada. He basically asked the question, now, does the pattern we saw at the wakas of Moche, does that hold in time? And can it be applied to the various sites of the north coast of Peru through time? And his answer is a resounding no. It's his work at the site of Sican in the Lambayeque area, which is about 100 70 kilometers north of Moche, and he started looking at sites that post-date the Moche. So here's a quick cultural history of this area. Was that during Moche times, perhaps there were multiple different independent Moche kingdoms in the valleys. After the fall of Moche around 8800, a new kingdom of polity developed in the Lambayeque area to the north, and that's called Sikan, with this site here. The site of Sikan is actually very amazing. This is just one of something like over 12 adobe wakas or pyramids, and there you see a jeep for scale. And what's also really curious is that these were built really fast. It was something like the 12 of them were built within 200 years. So how were they able to do it so fast? If you take a look at carefully, if you look at the erosion pattern, you might realize it's a little bit different from what a Huaca del Sol looked like, because Huaca del Sol was solid mud brick. They started using a method called the chamber and fill. Basically, I think in the Near East, you use the term casemate. It's basically you have these series of rooms or chambers, and then you fill that the rooms and chamber with earth and midden, and this is the way, a very expedient, quick way to get a Huaca to go up really quick. And here he found a very interesting pattern of the bricks being mixed together. So you no longer have a segment with bricks the same maker's marks and the same size. If you look at some of the diagrams here from Shimano's publication, you can see that they're mixing of marks, for example, right here. And even more interesting, if you look at this column here, these are bricks of all the same mark, but they differ in size. And then I guess you can't see the color, but they also differ in soil composition. So this is really weird. In the same place, you can have the same maker's mark, but the bricks differ in size and also in terms of its soil. He explained it by this, what he called the sponsor model. Basically, it's this some kind of sponsor or an elite basically commissioned or bought these bricks of different sizes, and then this elite marked it, and then contributed or commissioned the building of part of the Huaca. The key is this, that when we see this kind of now the mixing of brick sizes and marks, it means that the single chain of production now has been disrupted, because in the Moche model you have the same brick maker, and then they're the same brick layer, and that single sort of chain of production will lead to a segment with the same size and the same mark. But if you sort of interrupt the stages of the chains of operation, if you get a different group of bricklayers and a brick maker, you'll get a mixing of that. So that is the kind of basic process generating this pattern. And I observed the same thing on the site of Farfan on the north coast of Peru. This was basically a provincial center established by the Chimu when they conquered the Jequetepeque Valley around AD 1300. The Chimu was basically the successor to the Moche in the Moche Valley. And then later on, they built some would say, an empire, a coastal empire, and expanded up into the Jequetepeque Valley. This is the capital of the Chimu, called Chanchan. So it's really interesting because now they sort of gave up the practice of building really huge adobe pyramids, but they started making these urban sprawl of cities. A little animated here, talk about Chanchan, because it's truly massive. Then they start building these series of palaces, 9 of them, and then it mostly estimates that it covers something like 8 square kilometers as an urban core and 20 for the whole site. So it's a gigantic site, and Farfan was one of the centers established in a province. So this is the quick chronology. I'll skip that. So this is what Farfan, the site, looks like. It has actually a series of 6 rectangular compounds next to the Pan American Highway, and we sampled more than 4,000 bricks from Farfan, from all 6 compounds, just to look at brick variability. What's interesting right now in this period is that the Chimu no longer use maker's marks. So maker's mark actually disappeared. And right now, I'm just going to show you compound 2. We made 4 sort of Adobe sampling cuts, like the ones Shimada make, to just look at the bricks in situ in the construction to see brick size variability. This is compound 2, view from a nearby hill with a bus traveling a Pan American highway for scale. So here you can see that at Farfan, within the sectional wall, the brick sizes are all mixed up. You don't get sort of the bricks the same sizes in the same section anymore. And these are bricks coming out. I'll show you one in situ. So you can see that in this section, there's a mix of these sort of long rectangular bricks, the short, kind of wider ones. And sometimes they'll even use broken adobes, just kind of as a fill. So some right here. And then I try to use cluster analysis to tease out bricks of different sizes to see if from one area it might have see if the analysis can pick out brick sizes and put them into the right location. I couldn't. You see in this, they're all over the place, and the numbers denote which storeroom that brick come from, and the cluster that form cannot be used to predict where the bricks were coming from. I just want to contrast this data from the one from Huaca de Luna. I was there for 2004, and I collected some brick data from that area, and these are the marked bricks you saw. And at Huaca de la Luna, in the Moche culture, you could. Depending on which part of the excavation unit you're looking at, the cluster analysis can clearly pick out the bricks at different sizes and put them within that in that location. And here's a comparison of the Chimu with the Moche pattern. So what is going on? Basically, why did the maker's marks disappear during Chimu times? And this is very interesting because Professor Houston talked about sort of the non-linear nature of marks or writing. So this is instead of marks continuing, it disappeared. It a kind of mnemonic device, instead of continuing or getting more complicated, is no longer there. Why? Well, counterintuitively, I believe that marks are actually required when there's less supervision. I think that at some point that in the brick production process, it wasn't monitored, so that's why they needed marks. So, and when the marks were transported to the site of construction, that's where they could be used to account for whether the laborers were contributing enough bricks and also doing the construction. And by contrast, if you're closely monitoring and supervising work, you don't need mason's marks. So that's actually the logic, and in fact, and that's why you see a really a mixing of the brick sizes, is because somehow I believe that Chimu supervision was closer, and this might be related to just the sheer size of construction of the Moche Huacas. Maybe the Huaca is just so big, you need to be making the bricks from off-site and then putting them in. I want to briefly, before I conclude, I wanted to talk about the particular histories that Professor Howson talked about, that the presence and absence of mason's marks actually vary by valley in this time period. It disappeared in the Moche and Jequetepeque valleys, but it persisted in the Lambayeque area. So if we could correlate brick size variability, and mason's marks with kind of labor organization and supervision. And that means each valley on the north coast of Peru has its own particular history and trajectory of monitoring labor and counting for it. So this is my really sketchy thinking about the feedback between communities and construction. As Professor Gary Urton noted, that you could have sort of the demand from the state about construction and labor, but however, it depends on the community themselves and their inter-community interaction to generate them to comply with that demand. At the same time, the state, I'm going to explain some of the arrows and the terms. Basically, right here you see a competitive relationship between communities, and also could be corroborated in terms of exchange and local network. The state is demanding compliance in terms of labor and resources. It also could take advantage of the competitive relationship between communities, because in these early states, there's no separation of power. The ministerial class is basically a judiciary and also makes arbitration decisions. So any kind of intercommunity conflict, the state will make the arbitration, and the community sort of could gain favors by complying, by being a good citizen, always working on the monuments, or there's some routes through like bribery and favor. The other side of compliance is basically evasion and resistance. So I've been influenced by James Scott's work about refugia, and there's basically some segments of population completely remove themselves and escape into these sort of refuge communities. And other ways they could resist is basically through non-compliance or feet-dragging behavior, open rebellion, that's the most drastic case, and then a low-level assassination. Sometimes some people are just too cozy with the state, and you just find them disappeared or lost in the river somehow. So I bring this up because we often wonder why is it that accounting and administrative technology change. I think it's possible that the state has become better and better at accounting for labor and capturing that labor. At the same time, the communities are also getting better at dodging that responsibility. So when you have that, then you create a feedback relationship, and perhaps that accounts for the change in the method of labor organization that we see through time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Howard. We're doing very well in time, and I'm sure Howard would be willing to entertain some questions. But before perhaps doing that, I should also mention that at 12:15 we will adjourn for lunch, and the current plan is for John and I will also lead maybe a group to some different restaurants. There seems to be a lot of activity over on Fair Street, but we could probably...
And Jeff is going to
Jeff is doing as well. We'll move in separate clusters, and so just find the person you want to accompany, and then we'll come back here again very promptly, please, at 2 p.m.
I was very struck by the observation that initially the bricks were arranged in segments at Moche, and what I'm curious about is, were the maker's marks visible in the final building, or were they only visible during the actual construction?
They're probably only visible in the final construction because they're always on the top of the brick, and when they finally go up, you wouldn't be able to see them.
So those large sort of reveals where you saw the X's in your photograph, that's just in the process of archaeological excavation.
Yeah. And also they will, a lot of times they'll just plaster over the segment, so they'll be completely invisible in the final process.
I was not surprised, but amazed by your conclusion on the reasons for disappearance of control marks, because they are so strikingly similar to modern interpretation of disappearance of producer mint marks on Hellenistic coinage. There is a lot of mint marks on the coins of the 4th, 3rd century, and then they disappearing in the 1st century BC Ptolemaic Egypt. And one of the explanations is that the level of bureaucratic literacy grew to such extent that control marks were not needed anymore because everything was accounted by other means.
So for the Moche culture, we have no text, and then indigenous Andean civilization later, there's basically no text that's developed. Could you talk more about that? Actually, because that's supported by textual data.
That control marks are needed to when the state does involve in control of data. This is
Yeah.
And when the state controls much better by other means, then the need for control marks disappear. The same thing because this is not a question. This is just.
Yeah. Did I know what was the further development of supervision in Hellenistic Egypt? That
More literacy.
There's more literacy?
Yeah, because the level of recording was much lower, and so there was a need to have some marks that would indicate who is responsible for a particular issue. So this would be format of a mean, of a specific shift of a mean, and so they were responsible for amount of silver, for example, inside the coin. If something is wrong with the coin, it was necessary to find who is responsible for damage. So that's why these mean marks were used first and foremost.
I think it's a very interesting phenomenon where sometimes we get the disappearance of something, but that kind of indicates the appearance of something else that we're not picking up. In this case, I guess with the text, we could document that. But in terms of these atextual societies, it's kind of conjecture of what might have happened. I've been thinking about this that the text might disappear. The use of writing might just be a tiny blip in the existence of human beings. That in the future we might just have chips implanted in our brains and to quickly convey information, and then we'll look back and see writing and say, "Look how primitive this is." So think about that. No. Mm-hmm.
I actually was going to ask a very similar question with regard to John's paper earlier. The sort of appearance and the disappearance and the reappearance in a new form of all of these different marks. And it strikes me that in the case of Rome, from what we know about context, I wouldn't characterize Rome after Caracalla as being better organized or more centrally sort of having better central control than it was in the 2nd century and the 1st century. So clearly, the interpretation that we're proposing here, which makes perfect sense to me, may not always apply in every case. So I guess I'm wondering, what kind of, it seems to me a really good insight on the basis of obviously data that doesn't really articulate its reasons particularly explicitly. I'm wondering, do we have any kind of external corroboration other than the shape of bricks that suggests some kind of trajectory, some kind of comparatives, our ability that allows us to compare structures of state control between the Moche and the Chimu in such a way that we can actually corroborate this, perhaps not textually?
Absolutely. Well, the way to do it, it's indirect. So you look at actually other kind of production method by the Chimu, and sort of by the archaeological and also later ethno-historic data from the Spanish colonial records. It seems like the north coast of Peru had developed these really specialized economies. They actually have. They mentioned on the documents like albañiles, like masons, sort of a specialized mason class, and also olleros, specialized potter class, and there's also a group that only made spindle wheels. So it seems like there's, instead of the Moche mode of production where the community was responsible for brick production, brick construction, and the whole thing, the Chimu might have just had a specialized class of brick makers and then brick layers. So that's conjecture, but we I guess we do know the rest of Chimu society is highly specialized.
Howard, it strikes me that a lot of the marks that you're discussing are very simple, and thus, as with any simple mark, there's the potential of forgery or manipulation, as opposed to the more complex sealing practices where you really are making a mark that is intended to not be forgeable. a diagonal turns into an X so easily. And I'm wondering if there's any evidence of that sort of manipulation, if in fact these are a form of labor control or tax control, and in order to increase the apparent production of one group as opposed to another group. Do we have any sign at all that this was at play? It seems like it's the sort of thing that would inevitably be rife in a situation where you have a large polity that's controlling different groups' production and accounting for different group production. Do we have any sense of this?
Well, this is actually very interesting because this, what you just suggested, I didn't think about this, will actually support the notion that the brick production was happening elsewhere among the community. Is because the marks were made when the clay was still dry. Still wet, still moist. So it has to be done at the time of production. So the forgery cannot have happened, I think, unless you want to give the brick to the other community. Yeah, right. So you want to make your own mark. So. Oh, yeah.
I think one of the issues that we've been touching on here, a common theme, is also the absence versus the presence of these features. And I would think more broadly to the matter of, for instance, of pottery marks, and they are unknown in all of Mesoamerica. To my knowledge, I'm not even sure they're in Peru either. And the question, which is maybe an imponderable and not a question we can easily answer or address or pose even, is why do they not know this tradition? Why does it flourish elsewhere? In Mesoamerica, where I work, of course, you are given the literate equals and they're capable of making these marks, but for some reason they elect not to do so. We do have, something I noted years ago, in northern Guatemala where I work, we do have this almost moche pattern of vertical strips of poorly consolidated or integrated masonry, and it's long occurred to me that along with the casements or the kind of cellular internal structure of the pyramids, it has to do with labor obligations. That is, this group is responsible for filling that quantity of fill, or this other group is responsible for erecting that wall, not particularly caring about what's happening next to it. But I think this is a broader point that we've discussed later as well, absence, presence.
So my first slide is actually sorry, I'm gonna go all the way back. It's actually a post-firing incision mark on a pot. And this is not a maker's mark. This is actually made after the pot was fired. So it's the key is to look at when the mark was made in this in the stage of chain of operation. So in terms of pottery maker's mark, we do get them in Peru, and they show up on the bottom of these bowls and plates sometimes. And the hypothesis by Donnan is that it has to do with firing. So when you're pulling your pottery together during firing, you don't want to get confused. Then you start marking the pot. So it has to do with pulling behavior, and that's also observed among modern Andean fishermen. By John Gillen's ethnography, that when they pull their fish together, they'll mark the fish with a knife different ways to indicate whose fish it was. So it's just something to do with how you pull the things together, and you don't want to get confused. So, oh yeah. So,
I think time for one more question.
Yeah, I think Parker's, yeah.
I guess it very much depends on the organizational context. If you look at pop marks, for instance, in Egypt, at some periods in context are extremely common, and in some periods, for instance, New Guinea, which are extremely rare. And as for this organizational context, do I understand you correctly that this brick production is a fiscal obligation of the population? So actually, it is a kind of corvée, or is there also wage labor involved?
It's probably corvée because we don't know of any kind of a monetary system being used or currency being used in the pre-Hispanic Andes. So yeah, it's when Moseley first proposed this model, he very much used it's what is called the Inca Mita model. Basically, the Inca or demand labor, contribution of labor from the community, and they do it by segments. So there's this community will attend this amount of field and build this amount of the building. it's interesting to think about whether this is obligatory or voluntary. I think it's possible in some of the early, let's say, sites of the formative or pre-ceramic period. Some of the monuments we see could have been built by more voluntary labor, just each community putting up part of the building just to make a really nice monument for the community. But I think at this time period, when you see the use of marks, something is going on, some kind of accounting and some kind of obligation was required.
Thank you very much, Howard.